I'm not going to sort of run you through everything I've ever done. I decided to focus it much more on kind of the issues that are pertinent to the show that is here. So what I will show you is some of the work that really is, that are precursors and are seminal pieces that, or projects that led up to my thinking about the two pieces that are here. And then show archive material that relates to the work that's here, research, and then talk about the work that's here as well. Obviously, I will sort of, in the process that I will talk about my wider practice as well, but I really wanted to focus this evening on the work that's in the show. But also, quite importantly, I want to leave some time for me to not stand back, but come to the front, and for you to have questions, for us to have a discussion, for it to become more of a kind of dialogue between us all. So, hopefully, when I'm in the front, you can speak, you can tell me what you think, you can ask me all sorts of questions, and it could be a conversation between us all. So to start off with, what I want to show you is a series of works called Groups and Locations Moscow, which was made in 2004. And the reason why that piece of work or that project is really important to me, to my practice, and to the show here, is that it initiated what I think of as a sort of ongoing practice, but also ongoing sort of thinking and research question into how group portraiture in photography and moving imagery has the ability to speak about the relevance of collective and shared experiences. Now, initially, and to start off with, and I think it's maybe quite interesting for you to hear how the thinking developed and where it ended up with. Initially, it really started with, I made some work in Moscow of individuals, photographing them on locations that were relevant to their life. And a lot of the work up until this point had really been about questions of portraiture, mostly in relation to the individual. And the individual maybe in relation to their own personal history, their cultural history, how they situated themselves, maybe in relation to the society they were living in, the kind of stories that they had to tell about themselves. And this particular series of work started off in relation to this earlier series of individual portraits. And these individual portraits, and that is quite relevant to all the work, portraiture is a really complicated business, and I think it's highly relevant, but the question always that comes back to me all the time is how can you make portraits of people at this particular point in time when there's portraits everywhere, there's cameras everywhere, the roles and functions of traditional portraiture have been maybe undermined or emptied out, and what does it mean to make portraits of other people at the moment? So there's also both my desire for my own portraiture practice, but also the sort of questions are partly always tinged with a sort of question around the failures of portraiture. So these images started off through a series of research questions. I looked into the history of Russian photography and found these amazing portraits from the 19th century. They were all by now anonymous, meaning that by no longer identified photographers, and they were all categorized as types and views. And they, of the kind of imagery that you find in other cultures and countries as well, where people are placed in environments and are represented as a relationship between the people of a country and the kinds of landscapes they might be found in. And in the 19th century, these images in Russia came about through the desire to understand this huge country and its people. So types and views were these interesting, sort of powerful, but also quite oblique group portraits of random people scattered either on fields or squares or streets. And I was just really drawn to them. Now, while I was making the work with individual, at the time, girls, a series called Moscow Girls, in and around Moscow, I was really struck by how difficult it was to make photographs of any kind in the public space of this particular city, partly because there's huge prohibitions and restrictions against photography. And then the whole thing became, sort of, to me, more interesting or more complicated when in 2004 they passed a law in Russia that prohibited people's right to congregate in public places with more than 4 people. So for me, 3 things came together. This restriction against photography in public places, this prohibition against congregating in public places, and my sort of starting interest in group portraiture and the meanings of group portraiture. Hence this series, Groups and Locations, which was made in a sense in response to these three moments of, or these three interests, or these three points coming together. They're all made with passers-by, absolutely spontaneously. They're, in that sense, really performative in that they are almost a spontaneous performance that these people engage in with me, a performance for camera. I asked, in each case, the sort of passers-by whether they would agree to stand in front of the camera as a sort of quasi-group portrait. I would show them the old photographs and explain that the images I wanted to make were based on these 19th century anthropological ethnographic images, but also that they were a form of responding to the current situation. And the really interesting thing is that I think people largely understood that they were almost mini forms of protest, of disobedience. And because with as much as possible, I work with a small team of students, and we would take their email addresses afterwards, send them an image as a thank you for participating, but also then ask them how they sort of, what their response was to participating or to being part of this image. And quite often the response was that they knew that they shouldn't be standing there, they knew that they were contravening against restrictions. And quite often the police would turn up. So they had to have, these images also had to be made very, very quickly. Because either police would turn up, security force would turn up, and so the space of this image is really also, and that's how they were titled. The space of the image is both a location and a sort of sense of time. And the reason why they're all titled Monday 3:15 p.m. is because they're quite sharp in how the time that is available for the making of this image is really delineated by the restrictions imposed on the process of making them. I mean, a lot of the work prior to this is in some way looking into processes of participation, of making work with people rather than of people. Some of the earliest, very, very earliest work I made shortly after leaving the Royal College is I, for about 5 years, photographed my mother. And I photographed her naked first in the studio and then on location in all sorts of locations that are part of her ongoing life. And increasingly over those 5 years, the work really became the work I made with her rather than just of her. There's still images that depict her and that they're portraits of her, but they're really made out of a dialogue. So this sort of, in that case, obviously a long 5-year dialogue with one person is very different to asking a bunch of strangers to stand in an image for 10 minutes. But I think still there's various degrees of dialogue that make this work come about. And I think that's something that is really central to my entire thinking. That using cameras, to me, is not just about having a means of forming images. It's very much about articulating relationships between me and the people who are on the other side of the camera, but also very much between the people in front of the camera and the camera, because the camera inevitably instigates a change of behavior. It produces some sort of performance. People are always standing differently in front of the camera than they normally stand. They automatically produce an image. They produce themselves as an image. So those kinds of questions are sort of running through my entire, no matter what I look at, that is always very present in the work. I think sort of, with this, and that's partly why this piece of work became so, in a sense, seminal. It sort of set up all these kinds of research questions that then have sort of grown ever since then, and at various points of time became more inspired by sociology or psychology, but I think the questions were really sort of founded in this particular series of work. Shortly after finishing Groups and Locations Moscow in 2000, which I made in 2004 and 2005, I moved to Berlin, and I moved there for initially a year to make a new series of work for a specific exhibition and work on a small catalogue. And then had a show in 2006. And almost immediately upon arriving in Berlin, I found a series of postcards in an antiquarian bookshop. And these kinds of postcards sort of exist, in lots and lots of different places. where you see people standing outside either their homes, their residence, or their shops. And they're very much, again, these sorts of moments of a person being represented in relationship to the sort of quite intimate environments that partially at least define them. They have obviously this sort of Augustander type sort of dialogue around them, that people are represented as part of how they work and as part of where they live. In this particular case, these postcards became interesting to me because on the back of them, they would give the exact date when they were taken and the exact address where the image was made. And all these postcards were from 1905, 1906. I was in Berlin in 2005, 2006. So initially, this literally in the first few weeks of being in Berlin, and even though I'm German, I knew Berlin very much like an art tourist, and I didn't really know it as a resident. So I took these postcards initially as a sort of set of instructions to go on cycle rides to sort of far-flung outskirts, and to see whether these places, in which way these places still existed, whether the streets still there, whether the houses still there. And Berlin is interesting, obviously, in that respect, in that lots of cities have changed drastically throughout the 20th century, but Berlin possibly more than other European cities. It was hugely destroyed in both world wars, but also it is the divided city, or was the divided city. And even though lots of other German cities that were in the eastern part of Germany had massive changes imposed on them architecturally through sort of socialist rebuilding programs, Berlin in particular, whole of streets were eradicated and big socialist housing blocks and stuff. And it was really interesting to kind of see what had happened to particular kind of streets. So I went on these cycle rides, and because it had the exact addresses and dates, it sort of fairly quickly then formed an idea of what I wanted to make with them. So what I decided to do is that I would go back to each of these locations, see what the current buildings looked like, whether the street was still there, and then invite the people who currently live in those locations to come down on exactly the same date as the postcards were taken 100 years ago, exactly 100 years ago, and stand in the image. So if you look at this image and the image I then made in response to it, it's exactly the same building. Even though the facade has changed, the rendering of the building has changed, and I got back again, it's exactly, so if you look at the balconies and the windows there, it's exactly the same building. And so these images were made very much as these sort of open invitations to kind of, to all the residents. And quite often, there's 100 residents and 5 turn up. So it's kind of this, it's also about all sorts of other questions of to which extent to respond to an invitation by a stranger to participate in something where you meet a lot of other strangers. Because quite often, and that's why the project is called Neighbors Berlin, they're all neighbors. And arguably, in this image, they stand together as a group, and they form some sort of a group. But the only thing that unites them is that they have the same address. So they're not really a community, they're not really a group. They're an incoherent set of people that happen to decide that because they're neighbors, that they will stand together and sort of form this counter-image to something that happened 100 years ago. And the way it's shown, I'll show you, is they're always shown as both images. So you always get the postcard, obviously in its original size, and the new image side by side. So it's very much a piece of work consists of both these pieces together. This sort of invitation to strangers is sort of something that runs throughout the work, and is obviously quite pertinent to both the pieces here as well. And I will come back to that in a minute, because it's sort of something that I find really interesting, to which extent you can make these invitations to people and suggest that people become, in a sense, they become the work. It's not so much that they become part of it, they're really making it, to some extent they're making the work happen, because without them the work cannot exist. And it can only exist with those particular people. On the other hand, what it comes back to as well is this question of portraiture, of how you make a decision to photograph one person. Why would you, when you make a portrait, why would you decide that this person is the right person to put into a portrait? So those kind of questions quite often are eliminated through the kinds of structures I'm interested in working with. So I don't choose these people; they choose themselves. I invite all the possible people that could be in the image, and they self-select. The moment I was in Berlin, and this is quite typical, I of course immediately found something I wanted to do in London. And there's a museum at the end of the street where I live in Hackney, called the Jeffrey Museum. And for some reason I just moved to Berlin, I was back in Hackney, I was back in the area, and went to, I have no idea why, but I went to the Jeffrey Museum and found this little booklet called Lousy but Loyal. And it's a little blue book that has all these beautiful images in it that documents street parties from the early 20th century to about the 80s. Street parties obviously happened everywhere across the country, but the East End, possibly or arguably more than elsewhere in the country, has this really long-standing tradition of street celebrations, street parties, events that where the street absolutely becomes a social unit that belongs to all the people who live on those streets, and where they sort of really make it their own and inhabit it in a way that is possibly different from how people inhabit their streets today. So I was looking at these images, and of course immediately because of my interest in group portraiture and my sort of growing interest, well, public space has always been really important to the work. But increasingly I sort of really wanted to investigate what it means that something is public, or to which extent the public space that we think of public is the public, or to which extent it actually becomes private or has private interest in it or invested in it. So I was looking at a lot of these images, and there's sort of, you can see there's a bit of a chronology here. And really became struck by that these images, that in each case the street party happened and it went on all day and people celebrated, but the group portrait that was made was really almost like an event within an event. And the notion of an event has become really important to the work, possibly even in these two series that I showed you already, but with this film, with Celebration Cypress Street, that I then made this notion of an event, and that the proposition of the projects that I make, the proposition of making a piece of art or making a film, is really bound up with the notion of an event. So in this case, in the case of these research images, these archive images, the making of the photograph is really a sort of key event within the larger event of the street party. So in most cases, a local photographer would come along and gather everyone together, and they would take the group portrait, and then, of course, the party continues. But this is the image that most people would then hold and have, and that becomes people's memory. So I was very interested in photography's role. Of course, photography is, of course, bound up with memory, but in this case, that a whole event becomes encapsulated in this one group image. And hence, my idea for Celebration Cypress Street was so formed that I wanted to make a film that would be about the moment of a group portrait coming together. And I don't know whether most of you have seen the film. If not, maybe towards the end we can switch it on. The film is really, it's a continuous tracking shot through a street, and it's really about the moment of a group portrait building, of everybody coming together, similar to this image here, forming this sort of growing portrait, and where the portrait at some point becomes as still as a moving image portrait can ever become, because it never is, of course, quite still. But also Celebration Cypress Street, to me, quite importantly, was filmed on 35mm. So it's actually filmed on film stock, and on film stock that is as close as possible to photography, to a sort of an actual still image. So you could snip out one frame and have a slide. And it seemed really important that the materiality of that piece was really intimately linked to the real sort of coming together of photography and film that only can really arguably materially happen in 35mm. So this is last one from the 80s, and you see that the street party has become remarkably small. I then worked with people, or rather take one step back. One of the most important questions was, and it comes back to the question of how do you choose who you photograph for a portrait, which street in a sense, cast. So I felt like I had to cast the street that I would make this film with. And knew I wanted it to be in the traditional East End, and that I wanted it to have a particular kind of architecture. It is a sort of archetypal or typical East End architecture where the front doors open straight onto the sidewalk, which I think is important in the sense of how permeable the inside and the outside, the private and the public is. So I think there's a very different sense of the street and of how the houses, how the interior relates to the exterior, in those kinds of, in an architecture that opens straight onto the street, rather than having front gardens and steps and fences and all sorts of things that separate something again. So I wanted it to have this kind of really kind of traditional Eastern architecture. But also, I'm actually quite, in some ways, invested in the East End. I think the East End is, if anything is home, the East End is my home. And one of the things that I think is remarkable about it is the side-by-side of many different cultures that exist through all these waves and waves and waves of immigration that have happened over hundreds of years. I'm not just talking about the current mix of people or the current side-by-side or cohabitation of many different people, but that really these waves of change keep happening and have been happening for hundreds of years. So it was important to me that the street also had a really mixed demographic. And Cyprus Street is really interesting in that it's one of those streets that has people living on it, which I think is remarkable in sort of somewhere that's still quite central in London. People who live there all their life, they're 80, 90 years old, they've lived in the same house all their life. Their parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles have all lived on the street. So it has this real sense that people are kind of almost quite physically related to some of the buildings. And then one half is young professionals, private. There's quite a lot of, on both ends, there's housing estates. It has a big mixture of Bengali, Turkish, different Asian, Afro-Caribbean residents living there. And it sort of is a kind of a really interesting kind of demographic mix. And it was quite important to me to sort of try and reach lots and lots of different people. So once I sort of realized, well, had sort of narrowed it down to I really wanted to work with this particular street, I didn't know anybody on the street. So I just sort of started going onto the street and really sort of knocking on people's doors and sort of asking whether they thought it was possible that the street would make a piece of work with me, and they did, which is wonderful. And then work with them for sort of 6 months, and kept sort of like going back, talking to people, having lots of cups of tea. I probably know more people on that street than on my own street. And so spend a lot of time. I think that spending time is really important, investing in those kinds of relationships. And a lot of times the work I make has huge kind of sort of periods of time before I actually make anything, before I take a picture, before I even bring a camera onto the place. I spend quite a lot of time just sort of talking to people, being there. So this is kind of one of the ways that I wanted to familiarize people with the idea that there was a street party and we would make a film. The street has a long history of street celebrations, so that they all have huge archives of events that happened on the street. So they were absolutely familiar with the whole process, and they were really into it. And also importantly, they really wanted to take over certain elements. So a core group of residents really worked with me, and so one set of residents took care of all the food, another took care of the sort of children's activities. And that was important not simply as a way to kind of give them something to do or for me to have less to do, but for them to have a real sense that it was their event. Because just like the kind of archive images that I referred to, making the film was only ever going to be an event within an event. This sort of gives you a little bit of an idea that there was lots of activities all day long. And it started beautifully at 7 in the morning, when a lot of people came out and they swept the street. And I've got photographs of it. It's just really moving how like a lot of people come out, and we got rid of all the cars, which is one of the hardest things. One car remains, which I think is quite funny. And if you've seen the film, or if you will see the film, you see right at the end of the street there's one car that's still parked. But people would come out and sweep the street and kind of help decorate it. And it went on till late into the evening. and in the middle of it we made the film. The film, and like I said, if you've seen it, if you haven't, you'll see how the film in some way is probably lots of things that I've talked about this, but it's also itself in the sense that it's not choreographed. People are not told how to move. They move how they want to move. Obviously they come together for the group portrait, but I never told any of the people that they needed to walk in a particular way or gave them cues when to walk. It had to happen. And a lot of the work that I make, it has to happen within the parameters that I set, and then people are free to inhabit those parameters and do and behave and articulate the kinds of ideas that I've sort of brought to the piece. I want to show you a bit of research for Walk Square. Walk Square was made at the invitation of a museum in Hamburg. It's a museum called Deichterheim. It's a large contemporary art museum. And they approached me in sort of around a year ago. The director from the museum sort of came to see me and was sort of generally interested in what I do and just wanted to sort of check out the possibility of doing something at some point. And then the whole thing became much more concrete beginning of the year when he came back to the studio and sort of said, well, they are having an exhibition which is on at the moment called Wonder. And the exhibition really sort of investigates the philosophical condition of what a wonder might be, whether we believe in it, whether we doubt it, whether they exist, how they can be manifested, but how they, so it's an exhibition that even though it's largely art, it's not just contemporary art, it's also historical pieces, but it also has, it looks at philosophy, science, religion, and it sort of looks at a broader spectrum of what wonder might be. So they came back to me and said, would I be interested in making a piece of work for it specifically, and could I imagine working with 1,000 children? And 1,000 children to me immediately sounded fantastic. And because if you ever, if I ever wanted to work with 1,000 children, to kind of think about how to possibly get them together is really complicated. If someone sort of comes to you and says, do you want to work with 1,000 children? It sounds brilliant. So then I sort of started to think about what I wanted to do, and this image has been on my studio wall for a really, really long time. So the painting is called Fourth Estate, and what I love about it is not just the kind of, it has an enormous sense of dynamic and energy, but also it's very open in terms of is this a protest, is it a march demonstration? What are these people walking towards, and where they're coming from? What are the kind of implications of them striding forward? And in this case, obviously, being a painter, they kind of come towards supposedly the canvas, but to me, thinking the way I do is immediately the camera. But also, they're really walking towards a light. So this piece is quite important in terms of making a decision around that the children in the piece Walk Square walk towards the light. So that's how. But this is it was a very seminal, one of the really seminal pieces towards my thinking. Bruegel is another sort of painter who's kind of important in many ways. There's a number of sort of texts that recently have become really important to me. There's a writer called Barbara Ehrenreich who wrote a book, American writer wrote a book called Dancing in the Streets, the History of Collective Joy. And what she talks about, and she refers to people like Bruegel quite a lot, that through a number of sort of socio-political changes, but also religious changes, collective pleasure has sort of largely been suppressed. And it's largely been suppressed because government authorities realize quite clearly that collective pleasure has an enormous potential for revolutionary thought. That's suppressing collective pleasure is a way of control, a very strong way of control. The rave scene and the sense of eradication of the rave scene, one could argue, has got very little to do with, what's been sort of, said is the main reason for that, there's illegal drugs and it's dangerous to young people. I think it's much more to do with authority and control. These kinds of images, I think, are a real expression of moments of collective joy and collective experience. And I think it's really interesting what's happening in sort of a lot of sociological debates and writing at the moment. people like Philip Ball, who's written an important book called Critical Mass. There's another book I'm reading at the moment, which you might know about, called The Wisdom of Crowds. So there's a lot of conversation, dialogue, and research at the moment into the kinds of processes of collectivity that we might look back into. Ouija's famous photograph from Coney Island. There's lots of images. So these are all of these were images that I looked at when I first started thinking about Walk Square. But there are also images that I started to put together to actually start a series of workshops with children. So when I sort of thought about what I wanted to do, well, the major points of, well, there's a lot of these visual points of reference, but was also what's happening in the world at the moment. And I was really interested in the kind of, around the world, to which extent there's demonstrations, marches, riots, protests, and how walking collectively in the streets is an incredibly powerful language and a means of expression. So I was looking at lots and lots of images of walking and how people in general, but also maybe children, are walking through streets and what it might mean. What it means in terms of parades, carnivals, processions, pilgrimages, but also forms of protest. So I then started to put this together to hold the first workshop with the children. And the children that are in the film are from 6 to 17 years old. So it's quite an age span. And I sort of really wanted to think about a way of making this a piece that could work for this entire age span, where the small ones, they can get it and they can relate to it, and they can, it's possible for them to perform within it. But for the old ones, it doesn't become, it's not too simplistic. They can engage with it on a different intellectual level. These are just lots and lots of images from literally around the world, from America, from Vietnam, from Korea, from Palestine, from Israel, from America, that are about different kinds of moments where children have been on the streets and have either paraded or demonstrated for or against social change. And obviously very powerful Tahrir Square. Those kinds of, there were all kinds of very current political issues that have informed what I wanted to make. On the other hand, though, the piece of work that I have made is not political as such. It doesn't take a political moment and as an instigator for the piece of work. On the contrary, in a sense, in the piece, the children walk, and they walk arguably to make a piece of work. So what happened, and the way I sort of started to think through what I wanted to make with them, there are 1,000 children that come from 13 schools from all over Hamburg. And so I wanted the making of the piece of work, and in a sense art in the museum, to come the Pied Piper that would draw the children out of their schools and get them to cross the city from all directions and pour onto a square, and that goes back to the painting Fourth Estate and surround a light, a source of light. And the last image I want to show you is a really seminal performance, Bruce Naumann's piece, Walking the Square in an Exaggerated Manner, that he made in his studio when he was a young sculptor. And I think there's lots of theory around this piece, but partly what is really interesting to me in this piece is his question, how could he be a young sculptor in a studio and articulate himself as a sculptor and as a sculptural presence in space. And he walked the square, and it's a very beautiful and to me very moving piece. Now what I wanted to do partly is when the children are on the square, and I marked out exactly squares like that all across the square where they come together, and they pull back onto these squares, and then they walk the square, but they walk it not all in the same direction. They walk it in counterflow, so they walk clockwise and against clockwise, always one row against another, so that there's always a counterflow from one row to the next. It's in a sense of taking Bruce Naumann's piece, and sort of, if if you want to extrapolate it and make it a collective experience for these children. And these children, I mean, in some ways it's partly what was a big experiment is what would happen when 1,000 children that have never met each other before, they only know the kind of 20-odd other children that they are in a class with. What happens when they all come together on a square and there's 1,000 of them? What I've explained to them, and I did workshops with every single small group, but could they understand how that would work when they all came together? Could it come together? And can these kinds of, in a sense, experiments, can they work? And it was really interesting to see that until the day when we made the piece, there was no rehearsal, there was no way to do it twice, it was a one-off thing, and just either it had to work the way it worked, and there was kind of that, it would always just be the piece that was made in that particular moment. There is actually a couple of other images, which I will show you quickly. This is something that's sort of in the process of becoming. A week after filming Walk Square in Hamburg, I filmed another piece called Dance. And in fact, it's called Dance, in brackets, All Night Paris. And it's a piece of work that was sort of in pre-production for quite a long time. Sia and I talked about it in the past. And it brings together 10 different forms of dancing in a nighttime square. And all these dancers enter the square at sort of slightly different points of time and start dancing. So there's people dancing tango, there's people dancing traditional waltz, there's hip-hoppers, there's a set of cancan girls, there's flamenco dancers, there's Bollywood dancers, and they all come together and dance side by side. And they increasingly, they start, just sort of, they don't ever, it never becomes a hybrid, they always stay within their language. But the square sort of increasingly fills and becomes denser and denser. So that inevitably, sometimes, you know, the waltzers might dance around the hip-hoppers, or the hip-hoppers kind of get in the middle of the Bollywood dancers. But to me, this piece is very much about, again, it's a form of language, and different kinds of languages, and how they coexist side by side. It's a piece that it's not edited yet, so these are just production stills. I'm just starting to look at all the footage and start to edit it. But I thought that's kind of a possibly nice point to stop with something that's in the process of becoming.